Yep. Okay. Good evening, fellow listener, and welcome back to Saga of Old City, Part 8. What are we doing here? Well, we are reading together the first book of the Greyhawk Adventure series, one of the first series of books of Dungeons & Dragons. And we read also the first book of the Gord the Rogue Saga, the most notorious saga written by none other than Gygax. Do you know who Gygax is? Well, anyway, last time we found that the girls means trouble, even for a rogue like Gord. Because he saved a princess and he found himself with a surprise, a jailed surprise, and sentenced to death. Then his old friend Gallor saved him with some cunning action, and they traveled together far from Blimo, across the earth and to the land of the gnomes. Then we repressed from there. There are 3 or 4, I don't really know, chapters of Saga of Old City. Chapter 24. I felt myself comfortable. Sorry. I have a lot of chaos around me. not really the best place, but anyway, yeah. Now you see me very bad. Now it's a little better. Okay, good. Chapter 24. Good. The stone walls and burrows of the Gnome King domain gave Gord a touch of claustrophobia, but not because they were barely tall enough for him to walk through. Indeed, some of the chambers were quite large. Rather, the surrounding rock reminded him too much of his former prison in Blimo's Deep Dungeon, and also of his flight with Ivalic through the warren of passages beneath the palace at Stoink. The little gnarly demi-humans were friendly enough and even kind to him. The Gnome King wore an appealer, credo, I don't really know, gave the 2 humans not only an audience but a banquet. It was obvious that he knew Gallor from times past, and the king and the one-eyed man soon closed themselves, covering in private, as Gallor later told Gord, the affairs that were to be relayed to Realm Mord. Despite the friendliness of the gnomes, Gord was pleased when his friend told him that they would stay no longer than the 3 days that courtesy demanded, and thereafter they would move on. The grottos and jam budgets of the Gnome Kingdom were interesting, but for a short time. Even more intriguing to Gord were the gems displayed by this folk, but as a guest he could not apply his professional skills to acquire any of the valuables. Yes, 3 days was quite enough time to spend with the gnomes. Instead of heading westward toward Realm Mord when they departed, Gallor said they must go south to the area of Inspa first. Realm Mord could wait, for according to the Gnome King there was something brewing in the vast reaches of the Adri forest that needed looking into. The prospect of action excited Gord, and he cheerfully agreed to accompany his friend on this mission, volunteering to do whatever he could to aid Gallor. Sorry, I have some issues with this chair. Good. Sorry. I don't want to look me, I have to make space. Okay, now I don't really convinced by this. Anyway. They rode through the hills, making excellent time with help from gnomes and hillmen they encountered, coupled with Gallor's knowledge of the area. Gord was quite surprised to see several large contingents of armed gnomes, as well as some hillman warbands marching northward. Gallor told him that Gnome King Warren had sent out a call the very day the two of them had arrived, and the forces he was gathering would join the troops Nyrond had sent into the Blimu Hills. The ruler of the gnomes of the Flinty Hills desired to reestablish his kinsmen in the Blimus once again, while avenging the slaughter of those clans of the small demi-humans who had dwelt there before the hordes of orcs, gnolls, and others overrun the hills. The two warbands of hillmen would return home after lending their aid, but most of the gnomes would resettle in the northern uplands verged by the Tisar. With such armed might as Worm, the Flinty Hills were a safe place to be in, for no hostile humanoids or monsters dared to show themselves, while soldiers marched everywhere within these stores and vales. In a couple of days, the two adventurers descended from the mounds of the Flinties and took a road that ran parallel to the islands. This was the very route that Gord had decided would not carry him and Eva League toward Nurl, and he was gratified to find out now that this decision about the road had been correct. Now he and Gallor follow its course to Inspa, some 50 leagues distant. I have some issues with the phone today. As befitted the second part of its name, the town was a place of bubbling springs, some cool, some hot, and many of both oddly colored or imbued with strange odors. While a few of these were open and common, most were contained within some edifice or another. Besides these baths and centers that promised various sorts of invigoration, cures, and what not, the walled place had more hostels, taverns, and inns than any community Gord had ever experienced, hence the first part of its name. The place also boasted more than 100 religious buildings, ranging from small shrines to large temples and great cathedrals. Although Gord found one or two of the many sorts of waters offered for drinking to be flavorful or refreshing, he had no interest in mineral baths, immersions, geysering, showers, steaming, coating with mud, or any other such activities, and his experience with clericism, such as it was, made him shun the places of devotion and worship. All in all, he was very anxious to move on, just as he had been when with the gnomes a fortnight before. Fortunately for Gord, Inspa was located just within the edge of the westernmost fringe of the Eudry. They were so close to their destination that he suspected they would push on soon. Gallor had a few calls to make in the town and some information to gather, but after a day to rest their courses and allow them the luxury of stall and grain, the two were pushing into the depths of the timberland. The trees grew thickly over the last falls of the Flinties here, but his companion told Gord that soon the forest floor would become level. Soon turned out to be nearly 3 days, but then the terrain proved to be as promised. In the heart of the woodland, the trees were all towering giants, interlaced branches far above their heads, and dead leaves under their feet, made travel easy, since little underbrush could grow under such conditions. Gallor spent quite a bit of time pointing out different types of trees and animal signs to the city-bred young thief. Gord knew most of the common trees, oak, maple, hip, and chestnut, for instance. Hornwood and ash were not so familiar to him, and the rowan woods and great yews amazed him. He had heard of the yarpik tree, but never seen one, and its long and deadly thorns likewise fascinated him when the two wayfarers came across such a tree growing at the verge of a rocky meadow within the forest. Gord was also treated to his first sight of the gigantically antlered deer that roamed the Eudry. He and Gallor remained still when they encountered a herd of about a dozen such animals, and the beasts neither charged nor immediately fled. After the herd had bound away, Gallor said that the game within the woodland was plentiful. all sorts of bears, wild boars and sows, elk, deer, wolves, lions and smaller cats too, aurochs and herds of wild cattle, plus the usual variety of smaller sorts of game. Although the woodsfolk who lived within the Archery forest hunted frequently and with much success, they never took more than they needed. Further, Gallor explained their foresting of certain of the trees was done to provide grassy clearings for grazing and allow new growth as well. This seemed a quite intelligent and civilized way of life to the young thief, but this knowledge in no way prepared him for his first meeting with the forest dwellers, which came almost immediately thereafter. The road passed a meadow and along a game trail that wound eastward. At the widening of this path, an arrow suddenly tunked into the bole of a tree beside Gallor, and within seconds men clad in brown and green appeared among the trees all around them. Gord reached instinctively for his sword, but his friend stayed his hand with a gesture just as one of the tall woodsmen stepped forward from the foliage and spoke. "Gallor, you old bastard! That shaft came near to skewering your nose, and you never flinched," he shouted. "I trust your aim too well for flinching, Stalker, but you must be getting old too. I saw you at least 2 seconds before you loosed that arrow." "What brings you to our fair forest, you miserable minion of the mighty? Hear that there was a hot young dryad new to this place? Hell no! I wanted to see if you were really as ugly as I remembered you to be," the grinning one-eyed man retorted. "Then climb down off that nag and take a look with that one peeper you still got, 'cause when I get through with you, it will be swollen shut but good." As Gallor dismounted, Gord did the same, uncertain just what was going to happen. All that took place was a spirited round of hand-clasping and back-tumbing between Gallor and the one called Stalker, intermingled with more bad jokes and insults. Then Gord was introduced to the dozen woodsmen headed by Stalker, who all received him warmly. They reminded Gord of the hill folk that he and Gallor had encountered earlier on their journey, but to Gord's mild amazement, these men were even bigger. One huge fellow named Chart took on an instant liking to the small thief, and soon was telling him all about the forest, its folk, and the community. Chart said he was not originally from this portion of the forest, having been born and raised by the hill forester not distant, but he came to like the more civilized amenities offered in this neck of the woods, and had joined up with stalker boys. This information made Gord wonder what the hill foresters were like, for a rougher and taller lot than these woodsmen he could not imagine. Towering at least 2 inches above any of the other tall woodsmen, Shart was indeed a sight to behold. His huge shoulders and brawny chest tapered to a still massive waist, which looked less substantial than it actually was, only because his girth was small in relation to his great torso. His upper body was held up by 2 legs corded with muscles, and as large as tree trunks, while his mighty arms exuded the strength that had come from wielding axe and bow since childhood. Shart seemed to be totally unaware of his own stature and power, and Gord thought of him as a massive bear cub who had unknowingly grown into adulthood. A great paw clapped Gord on his shoulder, and a broad, handsome face topped by a tangled heap of curly brown hair smiled openly down at him. "Come on," said the giant, "stay in my hut while you are in town. Your pal Gallor will be batting the breeze with Stalker and Ned Horn all night." Gord wondered where town was, for all he saw was a closely grouped bunch of 30 or 40 rude log huts, so positioned and surrounded by growth as to make the cluster of small houses invisible from 100 yards away. Chart's own dwelling was built utilizing a partially fallen tree as the roof beam. The hut was roomier inside than it appeared to be from without, and although it was messy, the place was comfortable enough. His host casually dropped his huge longbow and quiver of arrows near the door, flipped his axe so that it buried itself in a log on the far wall, divested himself of his thick leather jerkin, and sprawled down on the heap of skins that served as his bed, telling Gord to round up whatever stray hides and pelts he could find, and there were plenty to be had, and relax too. "I've got some good ale there," Chart said, indicating a small barrel near his feet, "and drinking horns are everywhere. Just find one someplace, shake out whatever's in it, and help yourself. I want you to tell me what the rest of the country is like." Gord couldn't help but like this big barbarian yokel Togo he was. His quaint speech and unusual mannerism were unaffected and honest. These virtues disarmed Gord by easy stages, being unaccustomed as he was to meeting folk who displayed such straightforward characteristics. So the young thief soon found himself talking about Greyhawk City, Ernst, his foray into the theocracy, and so on. Between frequent interruptions for a question or some homely comparison to Chart's own limited scope of adventurous trekking, Gord managed to reveal a fair amount of what he had seen and done during his life. In turn, he discovered that although rustic, the steely-eyed barbarian was no savage, but rather a bold and a knowledgeable adventurer in his own realm of woodlands and wilds. Their conversation was cut short by one of the men from the forest door, calling them both to come to the concealed clearing. Chart jumped up, pulled on his leather jerkin, yanked his axe loose from its resting place, and tucked the weapon into his belt. When Gord asked his young host why he was donning armor and weapons for a meeting, Chart simply told him that everyone did so at such gatherings. So Gord buckled on his own sword just as another head poked into the hut. "Hey, Chart, let's go! I walk with you," the newcomer said. Then he smiled at Gord and introduced himself. "You must be Geller's friend, Gord. I'm Greenleaf, your servant, sir." He smiled more broadly as he added, "Friends call me Carley," while he passed a hand over his bald pate. "Sure, Carley," the barbarian Woodsman boomed in reply. "Let's all three go together. Gord's all set, and I'll just get my spear, and we can get moving." The gathering place was about half a mile from the camp. As they walked, Curly told the two younger men that there was serious trouble brewing, but he wouldn't say any more because it was Stalker, as leader of the community, who had the privilege and duty to bring such things before the people. Gord liked Curly right away, although he was quite an unusual character. There was no question he was of mixed parentage. His pointed ears and bright green eyes made his elfin ancestry obvious. His human heritage was evidenced by his hairless head, broad shoulders, and somewhat rotund build, plus his height of nearly 6 feet. Although the fellow appeared small next to the towering Chart, he was still bigger than Gord, who was actually about the same age as a mature male elf. Around Curly's neck was a gold chain, from which hung a golden sun with an enameled tree upon it. When Curly noticed Gord's curiosity about it, the fellow explained that the necklace was his devotional symbol, the sun and the tree of life, as he called it, being representations of nature. "We are druidical folk here, you know, and I am presently serving as the spiritual counselor of this little community," he told Gord earnestly. "And what of the little gold leaves forming the chain?" inquired Gord. "I see some are enameled green, while others are not." The druid said that this was just his particular preference, but Chart interjected that it was because he was proud of being a member of the 8th Circle, whatever that was, and if Gord could count that high, he'd find that 4 leaves on each side of the symbol had been colored green. Thus, 8 curled green leaves, denoting the druid's rank and his name too. "He's a show-off, but not a bad guy," Chart concluded, throwing a smirk in Curly's direction. They came to a place in the forest where the surrounding hills formed a small natural amphitheater. About 50 armed men were present, plus roughly the same number of women, most of them also bearing weapons, and many more children. The assemblage was quiet, and even the youngsters seemed dignified and reserved. As Gord watched, several more family groups and few lone men drifted from the trees that ringed the hilltops and moved to the place where they sat or stood while exchanging low greeting with those around them. Sorry, I have a little discomfort. Okay, good, now it's better. Curly Greenleaf took his sleeve of Gord and shirt and headed for a cleared place at the bottom of the bowl-shaped dell where both Stalker and Galler already stood. In a moment these two were joined by the druid and a tall, handsome woman, clad in a dark green robe, who appeared to be in her mid-30s. Gord asked Shirt who she was, and the barbarian replied that she was some sort of spellbinder or something, and he didn't trust her much. After looking slowly around the circumference of the dale, the leader of the community began speaking. Stalker's deep voice carried well, even though he was not shouting. The place was formed such that even those near the top of the low hillsides could hear him clearly. He simply announced that the gathering was summoned, so that all could hear the message of Galler, whom he referred to as an old and trusted friend of the folk who dwelled in Adry Forest. Stalker affirmed for the sake of those who did not know Galler that they could rely upon him for candor and truth. Free folk of Adry are not much concerned with the affairs of kings and princes, this I know, began Galler. Aerdi or Nyrond are not masters you wish to serve. Neither is desirable, so you pit one against the other and thus remain free of both, as well more than Roxas understand. There is a difference between the two thrones, Tug, and you are as able as I to state it. Nyrond and their allies think that their rule will be just and fair, while the Overking of Aerdi cares nothing for such ethical consideration, desiring only tyrannical power. There were a few murmurs from the listeners, several called out agreement, but note that even a well-meaning oppressor is still nothing more than a despot. Do not mistake my purpose, Galler cried in reply. I am not here to apologize for any crown, nor to urge acceptance for any yoke. You are Woodsman, and you bend your knee to no monarch. I serve many crowns, but I also desire nothing less than the right of liberty, which you now hold, and your continued freedom. That is why I stand before you now. Life and liberty are threatened, and it is my duty to give warning. This is a grave matter, and you must decide what course you will follow, Galler said somberly. The facts are these. What was mistaken for merely an ambitious scheme to create a petty new kingdom to the north is actually a machination of Ivied. At the mention of the Overking's name, several of the audience spat. The one-eyed speaker went on without comment. My own initial assessment of the situation was mistaken, and I have been party to this unwittingly until now. An Irondale army with many auxiliary forces is even now assembling to meet in the Blimu Hills. King Archibald himself will lead the force, and his purpose is to finish the destruction of the humanoid state that has ensconced itself in Bone Marsh, secure the new fief for Nyrond, and establish a strong frontier between that state and the advancing Reticans. Such in itself is of little interest to the free folk of Adry. Galler continued, as more scattered mutterings arose from the crowd, but there is more to the story than first seems. The force in the Blimu Hills now gives the Overking a target. If he can defeat the Nyrondale host there, Aerdi will regain the whole of her lost northern frontier, from the flinty hills to the mountains that guard Retic's southern border. Worse still, if the advancing Nyrondale army is caught in a cauldron between the Harp River and the Tizar Torrent, with Aerdian forces to the south and east, and savage tribes of humanoids to the north, then Archibald is between mountain and murder. He and a few could certainly make good an escape, but the rest will die by the thousands, unable to retreat and opposed by overwhelming numbers of foemen. Oh, the battle will be bloody on both sides, and the cost to the Malachite throne high, but what cares the Overking for soldiers? The slaughter of the Nyrondel army and its allied divisions will cripple the capacity of Archibald, even with help from the prelacy of Elmore, to defend its eastern borders. The Overking's frontier will leap westward in a rush, and all of Aedry Forest will be within the Great Kingdom once again. Ivy's heavy hand will grasp the lands from the flinty hills to that branch of the Harp River known as the Lyre. Ferrous Chathold will even fall, Ferrous not, but Almore will be hard-pressed to retain its lands east of the Harp. As Geller paused briefly to let this sink in, some of those assembled voiced their concern with shouts of, "How could all of this happen?" And "What will you have us to do?" and similar remarks. When the speaker resumed, he did so by responding to the crowd. "How came this to pass is unimportant," Geller admonished, "for you and I can only speculate fruitlessly. What is happening is that even as we speak, the might of the Great Kingdom is moving toward the goal I have just told you of. One of its armies musters in distant Jalpa, and another in Primp. Neither is likely to move immediately, but they will be held waiting victory in the north, and then Herzog Chalort's host will join that of Ivid to attack Elmore. Closer to home, the Overking's own guards, with many others too, have left Edgefell and are within the northern expanse of this great forest." Here Geller was forced to pause a full minute while the audience vented its surprise and anger at this revelation. That horde is led by a renegade woodsman and forest bandits who will guide the army swiftly to Woodford. It appears that its objective is to storm Knurl from the west, thus placing itself as an axe across the artery of Archibald's line of communication and supply. Meanwhile, the supposedly beaten forces of North Province, commanded by the Jackal Grenell, have marched from East Fair. This troop reportedly is bolstered with many mercenary, men-at-arms, and is picking up contingents of humanoids as it goes. Either at Flosh Crossing or Hungerford, the force will come across Teaser Torrent, thus closing the jaws of the trap upon Archibald. "And what can a handful of fighters do about all that?" demanded a bearded fellow at the front of the ringing circle of woodsfolk. "We have few," Stalker called back in reply. "The folk are many, however. If we send runners and Sperling here puts out her messages, and we thus gather ourselves, we too become an army. Why should we take arms against the stinking Aerdians to rescue the swine of Nyrond?" Came to the rejoinder from the bearded man. "It seems we benefit with such scoundrels as these fight each other. The dog commanded by Ivy dare not come far within these leafy precincts to carry his wreath." At this, Curly Greenleaf stepped forward. "They do indeed. They are entry into our forest," he said firmly. "I know this, for my brothers and sisters of our order have brought me word of this boldness, and because of it, we druids have decided to take the side of Nyrond. The advancing army has been wicked. All woods folk captured have been put to the sword. The sacred groves have been laid low," the druid said with clear hatred in his voice. "The evil forces move swiftly and attempt secrecy, but they cannot hem in all of us. Same folk manage to avoid the swarming scouts who go before the horde, and druids have other means of foiling capture. What is there now will be repeated again and again, unless these trespassers are given a lesson in manners," Curly concluded. Those remarks were greeted by general agreement and some cheering from the gathering. The brief debate ended, and the topic became how best to put the plan into action. Eventually, the woodsfolk agreed that a handful of the swiftest runners will carry word to the surrounding areas, and the forces of the area will meet at Oddgrave Hill. the place that Curly Greenleaf said was serving as the focal point for all of the woodsfolk willing to bear arms against the marauding army. Then the assembled folk quickly dispersed, each going off to ready his affairs for whatever part it chose in the coming days. Gellor pulled Gord aside and inquired what the young man planned to do. Gord said he had not thought much about it, but it was likely that he'd join with the Woodsmen if they had no objection. A fight such as this promised to be was something he had never experienced, and we could tell what would come out of it. His friend nodded in pleasure at Gord's decision, wished him well, and told Gord that he hoped to see him again when the bands gathered at Old Grave Hill for the march to Woodford. Gellor would be briefly occupied by certain things that needed his personal attention, but he said that he would be at the great gathering place before the warbands marched. It required the rest of that day and all of the next for the members of Stalker's community to prepare for their journey and to wait for the return of the messengers who had gone out. Gord busied himself by procuring a piece of tough but supple leather and using his dagger to cut and shape it into a sling, which he thought would be handy in the days to come. Then he searched out a good pouchful of properly sized stone, practiced for a while, and felt satisfied that his sling would be a good addition to the woodsfolk's large and varied collection of missile weapons. Counting a scattering of fighters who came from isolated dwellings nearby, the group that had assembled by nightfall of the second day numbered 20, about a third of whom were women. Most carried longbows and short, broad-bladed spears in addition to axes of all sorts, and a very few carried swords at their belts. Most of the women were clad in leathern coats and carried bows only slightly smaller than those of men. These latter folk were more heavily protected, generally wearing shirts of scale or chainmail under their rogue brown and green clothing. Shart had given his new companion a cloak of olive hue to wear over his black garments, and it was such a great expanse of cloth that Gord had to slice off a broad strip from its hem so that it would not drag on the ground behind him like some cleric's long ceremonial train. A friendly neighbor gladly plied her needle to make a new hem, and the cut-off strip became a tabard to cover the polished black cuirass of a hard leather Gord wore. Save for his black boots and his lack of a bow, he might have been one of the lads from the forest, bent on joining the impending fray. Next morning, as soon as it was light enough to see, the warband led by Stalker went forth, following forest path and game trail in northeasterly direction, heading for the rendezvous at Old Grave Hill. Curly Greenleaf was with the company, and rather than take a position of status at the head of the column, he strode merrily along with Gord and Shart near the rear, telling stories, uttering bad jokes, and the worst puns, and generally making the march seem shorter and easier by his presence. Gord asked Curly numerous questions about druids and the druidical belief, and the bold fellow was only too pleased to reply at length to such inquiries. Shart grumbled that he cared nothing about such stuff, but he listened all the same and occasionally chimed in himself on one point or another. They covered some 30 miles thus and picked up another 10 fighters along the route, so when evening camp was made, the war band numbered over 50. Stalker spoke to the warriors that night, giving them advice on how the enemy was likely to react and fight. The arrows of the woodsfolk must be made to tell, for at close quarters the well-armored Aerdians were certainly likely to give far better than they got. The warband leader then divided his company into 5 sub-bands. Each of these squads had its own leader who would take instruction from Stalker and see that the fighters in his or her group did precisely what they were told. Both Gord and Shart were assigned to a woman called Wren, who was nothing like her name, being nearly as tall as Shart and hefting a bardish, heavier than the brawny barbarian's own great axe. As the 2 young men were eating their portions of the half-raw, greasy meat provided by a hungry bear that had ventured close to the humans, thinking to find its own dinner, their newly assigned commander came over and joined them. Wren gnawed on a piece of meat, eyed them critically, and addressed Shart first. "You, I know about, big boy," she said disdainfully but in a jesting tone. "Stay back and don't go rushing out until I give you a whistle. Now, what about Shorty here? He hasn't got a bow, and is too small to go hand to hand with those beefy soldiers the Overking favors. Can he tend wounded?" This irritated the young thief, so he snapped off a response before the barbarian could swallow the hunk of toad meat he was chewing on and reply to the query, which was actually directed at Shart. "The name is Gord," he said angrily. "I answer all questions about myself, and I fight well enough for any to fear, beefy soldier and beefy woodsman alike." As soon as he said that last statement, Gord regretted his word. What he had said was insulting and unfair, and it was foolish to pick a quarrel with one's swordmate. Besides, while she was large indeed, the proportions displayed by Wren were by no means beefy. Voluptuous, yes, but not beefy. The woman took no offense, in fact. Her reaction was quite the opposite of what Gord had expected to hear. "Gord it is," she said, buffeting him on the back in comradely fashion. "If you fight as talk as you talk, then I'll be glad to have you by my side." Gord drew forth his sling, displaying the tongued leather pouch to both Wren and Shart. "This bit of hide can send stony kisses to enemies just as your bows send their shafts," he said. "Although I admit that amidst these trunks it is a more difficult task. I also ply short sword and dagger with sufficient skill to have brought ruin to one or two foemen. Trust me to fight alongside my fellows, as long as there is cause to do so." Wren sat with them and proceeded to finish her meal in their company. The three talked, and it soon became obvious to Gord that her purpose was to seek out Shart, not to speak of the coming battle or give instructions. The muscular giant was friendly and talkative in return, but he made no response to the overtures Wren offered, and when she said she thought a walk in the forest would help her to loosen tired muscles and cause sounder sleep, Shart cheerfully wished the brown-haired and buxom warrior an enjoyable stroll and a good slumber. Her hazel eyes snapping, Wren left with a curt nod, her long braids bouncing. "Shart is not a playboy," that for sure. "Are you blind, man?" Gord hissed at his companion. "That woman is terrific, and she was almost begging you to go off into the woods for some loving." Shart shrugged, and Gord grew suddenly suspicious. "You are not..." He let the talk trail off, reluctant to finish it, and sorry that he had brought up the subject. "No!" Shart asserted haughtily, fully aware of what Gord had been getting at. "It's just that I only like women with golden tresses and eyes of azure. Sometime I'll tell you about a dark-haired wench who nearly sundered my heart. But not now. The time has come to flush talk of females and get some shut-eye." Gord was tired from the hard and fast trek, so he readily agreed. Both men slept soundly until morning, ate the meager ration allotted to them, and were once again striding along toward the gathering place at Oddgrave Hill. That day and the next were pretty much the same, and Gord grew used to the marching, so he was less irritable and more lively when dusk fell. Shart and Wren had resumed an easy, bantering relationship the day after he had spurned her advances. Shart himself had broken the standoff by pinching the woman and making a suggestive comment. Soon she was as friendly and cheerful as before, and the barbarian giant was now almost piercing rather than being pierced. Gord thought that Feroz Shart was both a bit shy with women and not very experienced with their ways, so that instead of being unresponsive to Wren's offer of favors, the fellow had simply not understood the intent. Well, it was too late now, for the next day they would be at the great gathering, and then off to Woodford, he supposed, to confront the advancing horde. By the time Gord and his companion arrived at Oddgrave Hill, several thousand of the free wood folk were gathered there, all armed and preparing for the battle. Starker's warband became a part of a brigade numbering nearly 1,000. This force was to be a flank company with some special mission that would stay undisclosed until the whole army was in position. More groups came in on the same day the Stalkers did, and at the Leaders' Council held that night it was decided to wait no longer for any others who might be on their way. The army of Woodsmen now totaled about 6,000 in all, and no more than a few hundred additional fighters could be expected. The time was at hand to march the 10 remaining leagues between them and the crossing of the Harp, so that the invading army sent by Overking Ivid of Aerdi would have to fight both river and woods folk in order to succeed. End of chapter 24. Sorry, I mistake. And we take a brief pause, then we read the next chapter. I return in a second. Barabam. Ah, damn. Come on, okay. The water bottle exploded in my face. Not a pleasant reaction, seeing that. Okay, good. 1 minute and then we take on where we left. No problem, man. Okay, good. Good. Okay, so anyway, I have to make one thing, and after that, I have to go out. Okay, good enough. Sorry for the waiting. Now I have to do a thing and then we can start. Sorry. Good. Seven, good, and 8, good. Okay, good. Okay, and now you heard some rumor on the phone because I have to do one thing, but ignore it. Yeah, it is my PC. I due well. Good. Let's start with another chapter. Chapter 25. I think we only read 3 chapters today because it's a bit late. I start late, I admit it. Then chapter 25. I think there is a battle inside. It's pretty hot nowadays. The broad waters of the Harp River at Woodford were wide and rippling between 3 line banks. Save for a deeper channel near the western shore, the depth was nowhere above the knees. At the one deeper place, a stretch of ferrous 15 yards in width, the water had managed to dig a place nearly waist deep, but solid granite bedrock had resisted the erosion beyond this, and had resisted the erosion beyond this, and man, animal, or even cart could ford the river here without difficulty or danger of drowning. A narrow road, one of only very few indeed within the Archery forest, led to the shallow place and away from the other side of the river. This set of pleasant circumstances had led to many groups using this ford, the latest of which was to be the army of Overking Ivid, which was advancing toward the river from the east. The Overking's force was an impressive one. Ahead of the formation went a swarm of light troops, some afoot and some horsed, to scout and make certain that no man encountered could carry news of the armies coming to its enemies. These scouts were evil woodsmen, bandits, and the worst of the mercenary companies, and they were like a small army themselves, for they numbered well over 1,000, with a main body of light cavalry ready to charge into battle or carry news swiftly to the horde behind. Normally, these advanced troops were anywhere from half a mile to 2 miles ahead of the slow-moving army behind. The roadway allowed them to move faster than usual, however, and they were now easily 2 leagues in advance of their fellows. The advance group's commander, General Lomor, the Margrave of Askage, drove this swarm of murderers and looters far ahead today because he feared that there would be a hostile force burying the fort. Also, for this same reason, he had with him several companies of light mercenary infantry, plus a squadron of the Overking's personal armored lancers. With this reinforcement, he felt he could brush aside any resistance and hold the crossing until the bulk of the army came up. General Lomor was pleased to find the place tranquil on the morning he arrived. Several hundred scouts had splashed through the cold water and combed the west bank, sending back word that no sign of an enemy could be found. Now his whole force was past the dangerous ford, while a courier group hastened back to give this happy intelligence to Grand Marshal Drake. The Aerdian general was just giving orders to send a small company of mercenary horse and foot farther ahead, while the main body of the advance waited for word from the rear, when a storm of arrows rained upon the troops. The broadened shaft beat through armor, killing men and horses as if a giant shite had passed through the forts. Even as the first shouts and screams were being voiced, a second volley of missiles struck, and then a third. The general, being not a complete fool, understood immediately that a horseshoe-shaped ambush had been laid on this western side of the river, and his soldiers were caught between the offensive and the waters they had just forded. He turned and rode off immediately, as bright gold and red banner bearing the arms of Askage, signaling the route of the retreat, even as his herald sounded the fact on his horn. The general made good his flight, but no more than a few notes came from the herald's trumpet before a half-dozen long arrows silenced its owner forever. Half of the advance force of the Aerdian army escaped the ambush. The survivors were mostly mounted, of course, their horses enabling them to flee the onrush of men that followed the initial arrow storm. General Lomor was at midstream on his way back across the river when the fullness of his disaster came upon him. More cloth-yard shafts flew from the supposedly safe bank to the east. His accompanying clerics and the magic user near them began to prepare their spells, but, exposed as they were in the middle of the river, none managed anything significant. The Margrave attempted to rally his remaining troops and make a stand where they were, while the spellbinders sheltered behind shields and men to work there desperately needed assistance. Suddenly, a cloud of biting and stinging insects buzzed around the trapped force. There was a confused scramble among men and mounts, all trying to escape the plague of pests, while still more arrows sped into the cluster of invaders with a sound similar to the hornets that were stinging them with less deadly effect. The sole surviving magic user, a warlock calling himself Comet, managed to dispel the magically created insect swarm, but then the enemies from both sides of the river closed on the trapped remnants of the Aerdian advance force. General Lomor threw down his sword and cried for quarter, but no prisoners were being taken. His body fell into the water moments later, across that of his warlock, and the fight was over. Not one of the invaders remained alive, and none had succeeded in breaking through the ambush to get back and warn their fellows. An hour passed before the lead elements of the Erdian main battle, as the central division of the army was called, arrived at Woodford. The place was quiet, the waters were still, and no trace of fighting was apparent. The troop of light horse saw a strong body of mercenary infantry spread about on the opposite shore, evidently on guard against any possible foe, but obviously relaxed in awaiting the arrival of the Grand Marshal's army so they could push forward again to scout. Just visible on the road in the distance was the banner of General Lomor, the ensign surrounded by a small body of cavalry moving westward away from the river. Another small body of mounted men appeared from the trees along the east bank and waved to their fellows on the opposite side of the Harp river, signaling that all was well. The cavalry troop came across the ford first, keeping their horses at a slow but steady walk. The head of the marshal's long column of soldiers was marching swiftly toward the crossing place, and the horsemen wished to get clear of the ford before the soldiers arrived. There was no love lost between the cavalry, who were mercenaries, and the oncoming imperial and noble contingents. The blue and gold tabards of the Overking's guard proclaimed the coming of the army. Although the noon sun was now being obscured by slowly thickening clouds, the crowned sun on each tabard's deep blue field seemed to glitter without the aid of beams from the real one above. The leading regiment was of archers, 1,000 strong, short bows slung, short spears shouldered for the march. Behind them came a like regiment of crossbowmen, equipped with great arbalets and swords. Together, these two units composed the 1st Brigade of heavy foot, for they wore chainmail and stood in close formation. Behind them came the serial ranks of pole-armed infantry, Imperial troops who bore Glaives guisarmes and Faucets forks. After a suitable interval came to the disdainful and haughty riders of Ivy's own cavalry, light horsemen with small crossbows, bucklers, and javelins. Then mounted sergeants and plate mail with lances, flails, and shields, and finally the so-called Knights of the Malachite Throne, in even heavier armor, bearing an array of heavy swords and axes in addition to lance and shield. All of these horsemen held their slender javelins and long lances aloft, pennons astream, to proudly proclaim their presence. Although there were but 3,000 of them, they considered themselves to be the finest and best soldiers in the army. In truth, these cavalry were indeed terrible foes in battle, but in a place such as the Archery forest they were not of much use. They, and the pole-armed phalanxes as well, were much better suited for employment in the open terrain at Knurl and in the Blimu hills. At some little distance after the horsemen came a regiment of Vulgars. Their long weapons surmounted by cleaver-like steel heads, and also proclaiming their imperial status by their bold colors. Thereafter came the train of artillerists, engineers, and sappers who marched with the baggage and supply. A small company of mercenary light cavalry served as a drop punctuation at the end of the Overking's main battle. A quarter of a mile farther back, the rear portion of this host was arrived. This last division was a motley collection, composed of some 2,000 infantry belonging to the noble contingents levied at the Overking's behest. These footmen displayed a rainbow of colors and armorial devices, marking which lord they served. Weapons and armor likewise varied as widely, ranging from ransor and halberd to axe and crossbow. There were relatively few infantry in this unit compared to the total number of men in the forts, because their noble masters deemed such troops to be fit mainly for use as a buffer to absorb missiles and even magical attacks prior to the charge of their more numerous mounted troops. Farther back, a host of pennons, bannerols, and oddly shaped standards marked the noble lords, knights, and esquires who were riding before an even larger group of their mounted men-at-arms. As varied as the foregoing foot soldiers, this group of cavalry was as numerous as the Imperial horsemen, although of questionable merit at times due to lack of discipline, for every baron, plar, count, or whatever felt himself a prince and peer to all the others. Nonetheless, once it was in motion, this mixed brigade was formidable in the extreme. At a respectful interval came the last elements of the army, a tail of mercenary light horse and skirmish infantry to tail in perhaps another 1,000, preset to absorb any sudden surprise from the rear. This vast force, strung out for miles, was about to receive a blow upon its head that the body and tail would be able to react to in Saurian fashion only. The foremost riders were well across the ford, and amidst their supposed counterparts, before a sharp-eyed member of the mercenary troop alerted his fellows that the men around them were not friends. The resulting melee decimated the forts and sent the survivors en route, but served to alert the archers who were nearly across the river, and the crossbowmen just behind, and thus the whole main battle soon knew what was happening. The battle at Woodford now commenced. The long bowmen of the woods folk were ranged for 300 yards along the west bank of the river, hidden in the foliage and sheltered by logs and tree trunks. These archers opened a withering discharge upon their enemy counterparts, the devastation of which was only slightly lessened by the target's armor. Despite losses and disadvantage, the Imperial troops held firm, slowly spreading out their formation to present a broad front so they could not be as easily hit, and so as to be able to reply in kind to the hail of arrows, bolts, and slaying bullets pouring upon their ranks. They were brave, these men, and half were slain or wounded by the time they were stretched the entire length of the shallows of the Harp, and were returning their own missiles in hopes of finding targets clad in colors that blended with the forest. The disciplined sacrifice of the archers was not in vain, for coming at the double was the narrow column of pole-armed infantry. When their bristling mass of Glaives and Faucets crossed the ford and struck into the lightly protected archers on the far shore, the sharp edges and points would pierce the woodsman's line and spread out along the river edge. Thus the onslaught of flying shafts will be assuaged, and the cruel tormentors plying their deadly bows will be slain. Although arrows rain in arching fire over the heads of the screening shore bowmen and crossbowmen to fall upon the rushing brigade of infantry, these latter men were more heavily armored, with studded jacks of padded leather over chainmail, and their front ranks were provided with steel chest plates and greaves as well. A few fell, but most came on unarmed. The screen of bowmen before them parted at their coming, glad that their comrades' ferocity and lusting for the slaughter that their arrival portended. This parting enabled the woodsmen to increase the effect of their archery upon the infantry, however, and whole ranks of the pole-armed Imperials dropped before a new onslaught of Iros. Still, those behind came grimly on, lowering their weapons as they filled the front of the column, stepping over the fallen in their path. Had the water not slowed their advance, far fewer would have been killed, but this was not the case. Finally, the ford was crossed by the leading men of the column, but their rush fell onto empty ground, for the woodsmen had fallen back before the Imperial charge. 100 yards away, a company of bowmen continued to stand across the open road, loosing missiles steadily at their foemen, while from the flanking woods came still more shafts. As the full force of the pole-armed brigade came onto firm ground, its parts were sent left, right, and ahead to clear the trees of snipers. In such conditions, True's shorted axe, morning star, and sword are as good as, or even better than, the long-handled weapons the Imperials carried. A raging melee swirled through the trees, as that part of the woodsfolk contingent without missiles weapon no longer had to stand and watch their fellows work. They fell to with joy. At this point, the defending force had suffered losses numbering only a few hundred, while the invading army sent into the Aedry by the Overking had lost thousands. The foresters' hearts were singing, and their hopes were high. After serving as the hard place against which the nut of the vanguard of the Imperial army had been wiped out, Gord's unit had recrossed the Harp and rejoined the others. They had not suffered more than a dozen casualties, thanks to Curly Leaf's use of spells and their own hard fighting. They were then sent off to a place on the left flank where they were hidden and kept ready to reinforce either those who held the bank before them or the center, where the hardest blow was sure to fall. From his unit's hiding place, Gord was unable to see any of the initial fighting against the main force, but word came that the hated Imperial archers and crossbowmen had been cut down by fully 2/3, and that the brigade of infantry that followed was being mauled by the savage Woodsmen. The sounds of the battle were coming closer. "I'm ready to trash some of those libertines," Shard said, nervously flipping his great axe. "Let's have a contest, you and me," said Oran. "The one who knocks over the most of those blue-back sissies gets the other a servant for the evening." Their banter was interrupted by the voice of a captain who was calling the group into a rogue line. Stalker's band went on to the far right, archers in the front rank and others behind. Both Gord and his hulking friend were thus at the forefront, for Ren was impressed with the aim Gord had displayed while slinging missiles at the Erdian's hired soldiery horse earlier. A lot of age. Curly Greenleaf was off somewhere else, probably with the commanders of this unit, Gord theorized, for he now realized just how powerful spellcasters of any nature could be, and druids in particular. He made a mental note to avoid finding out what it was like to be on the wrong end of some hostile spellbinder's pointing finger. The sounds of fighting were closer than ever now, and whistles alerted the waiting woodsfolk to be ready. Arrows were knocked, and Gord placed one of his stones in his sling. Almost without warning, a knot of men burst into their view. Imperial troops with wicked-looking faucet forks, chivying several defenders with shorter weapons, were unable to score damage on the advancing men-at-arms. Gord loosed the stone from his sling, just as the first of a cloud of arrows sped into the confident Imperials. Gord's eye followed the path of the missile he had released, and saw his target go down as the stone struck him full on the temple. Thrown into disarray by a missile attack they had not anticipated, the remainder of the foot soldiers were easy prey for the men they had been preparing to kill. The captain signaled to the members of Gord's band to move ahead, and they advanced along with similar groups to the right and left, going slowly and using all the cover available. After a few score yards they were halted again, for beyond there was less cover and fewer trees. In this partial clearing stood hundreds of the Overking's heavy infantry in blue and gold. "That's 3 of those bomb-blasting... wrong page, I think. Sorry. What? Hello? Okay, heavy infantry in blue and gold. Wrong page, my e-reader panicked. Forming for an attack toward them. Then Woodsman on the Imperial forces' left flank came howling out of the forest. The disciplined formation turned to face this challenge, only to have its new flank assaulted by missiles from Gord's group and the others on either side. The Overking's men fell back in confusion, heading for the river, but since there were some 200 bowmen, slingers and javeliners along their route of retreat, they were soon forced into an oblique retrograde. "That's 3 of those bomb-blasting Imperials I've nailed so far this round," shouted Shard from his post at Gord's side. Ren's voice from the rear called back derisively, "Never mind counting the needlework. Our wager is your axe versus my little chopper here." The order came to advance upon the struggling Imperials. Gord and his compatriots rushed across the open space and into the trees on the opposite side, in hot pursuit, and soon close work demanded the tossing aside of bows in favor of axe, sword and like arms. Now the full force of the big woodsfolk was falling on the soldiers of the Overking, and the infantry was being pushed back and crowded into a defensive position at the head of the ford. Then the Imperial hordes, having finished their crossing, were amongst their own footmen, and in their desire to strike at the enemy, the cavalry were careless as to who they rode down. By the time they got through the lines of pole-armed soldiers and rode toward their adversaries, it was evident that the infantry brigade would not be fit to contest with another foe for some time to come. Gord was close enough to the river now to see some of the displays of magic that marked where the spellcasters of the opposing forces were trying to gain an advantage for their own side. A horrible-looking thing, seemingly formed from the very waters of the Harp, rose up suddenly and was rushing toward the rear of the long line of horsemen, but it suddenly seemed to lose speed and sag, then rippled into nothingness. Little darts of glowing coral color leapt from the far shore to strike and slay any woodsman who showed a target. A great cloud of ghastly citrine hue formed in a place above the river where no Imperials were fighting, and it quickly traveled westward with a roiling, sickening movement. It touched the tree line, and Gord heard screams and cawing cries. Then it was blown downstream by some gust of wind, and the Imperial horse recoiled from its edge. Then came great claps of thunderous noise, and streaks of lightning and explosive flashes of fire were flying back and forth, slaying friend and foe so indiscriminately that the processes were soon stopped. The Imperial cavalry regrouped and came on again. Then the sky, which had grown darker and cloudier by slow degrees, began to release a cold, fine rain. "Shit! There goes the bows!" grumbled Shirt. "Now it's time for our contest," logged Wren in reply to his remark. "Stay out of the way of those crazy magicians," was all that Gord could add as he waited for the horsemen to ride them down. As the lances lowered and destriers began to move forward at a trot, the heavens were torn by jagged strokes of lightning. These bolts streaked down amidst enemy knights and their attendant riders, making metal glow and crackle, bringing down men and steeds in smoking ruins. In reply, a whirlwind suddenly swooped down out of the lowering sky and tore into the ranks of the waiting woodsfolk. The cavalry charged ahead to escape the crackling electricity, and their adversaries ran to meet them rather than face the roaring destruction of the tornado that was shredding trees and men alike. Once melee was joined, the dreadful destructions of the deadly Diomers cheersed, for bloody war was now the sole purview of fighter and ranger, barbarian and cavalier. The rain went from drizzle to downpour, augmented by sudden bursts of red blinding raindrops. This condition prevented the Imperial horsemen from making a slaughter of their unmounted foes. Nevertheless, their lances and great swords took a heavy toll on the brave defenders. Gord fought silently and kept near Shirt, who was now nearly berserk, swinging his broad axe with both hands and so powerfully as to sunder steel and flesh in a single stroke. In turn, Shirt stayed near the Amazonian female who commanded their squad, a unit that now numbered only 4. The ground underfoot became a mire of mud, blood, and bodies. There were screams and howls mixed with banging and clashing, a cacophony that numbed the mind as much as the weapon work deadened the soul. Gord lost count of how many men he had met. Some were before him one moment, and after stroke and counter were swept away in the press of melee, shouting, struggling humanity. Others remained long enough to thrust or cut and parry until Gord slew them. In the process he had taken many wounds himself, but none were serious. His greatest enemy now was the growing fatigue brought by exertion and tension of battle. How long could this awful melee continue? Until one side or the other was dead, or broke and fled. Either way, he must fight on. Gord saw that the cavalrymen, most of them dismounted now, were slowly breaking off and falling back, but supporting them were a body of mercenaries and a group of men armed with long vulges. Gord realized that fresh contingents of the Overking's large force had managed to cross the river and take up formation. Through breaks in the crowd of warriors, he could see that beyond these newly arrived soldiers were a great cluster of men still wading the ford. Then the rain sheet down again, and his vision was obscured. Gord prepared himself for the end, silently cursing himself for ever wishing to have seen a battle between armies. "Stop gawking at the frigging enemy, and get the hell out of here!" Shirt shouted in his ear. Gord started and looked around. The woodsfolk were sprinting westward into the trees, away from the Imperial army. There seemed to be a few hundred newly arrived warband members there, trying to make a rear guard for the exhausted, beaten remnant now in flight from the ford. A few slingers among these newcomers augmented by stragglers from the war groups disengaging from combat, enabled the Woodsmen to manage a desultory discharge. Gord was glad he had no misses left and could pass through this line without feeling cowardly. In a few minutes the Woodsmen were clear of the battle scene, and the rain suddenly stopped. Leaders, chiefs, and captains urged the retreating force to hurry on, away from Woodford and the army that would certainly be in full pursuit. After another 100 yards of retreat, Gord understood the reason for this order, for he and his comrades were passing through a formation of carefully concealed Sylvan elves, just taking bows from oil leather cases and setting spears and swords at ready. There would be yet another nasty surprise for the invading horde before this day ended. Finally, hours later, the scattered remnants of the once-proud assemblage of free forest fighters began rallying in a small valley south of the battle area. Of the thousands who had gone forth, only about half remained. They were all dejected and downcast when Gallor and several other men, accompanied by the 2 women and the slender elf, worked their way through the slumped warriors. Gallor's presence heartened the fighters, and he soon had their attention. Gord, Shart, and Ran moved closer to where he and the group with him stood. Gallor waved a smile and spoke. "What you haven't done today will go down in the annals of history," he said warmly. "Don't feel defeated. You have won. 6,000 of you have killed or wounded more than that number of the enemy. You have wiped out the advanced division of the Overking's army, mauled his vaunted guardsmen, foot and horse alike, and blunted the edge of Ivid's invasion. You had no choice but to fall back before an army that numbered twice your strength. You took the worst of clerics and magicians' spells and held your ground. Only numbers of fresh and heavily armored foes forced you from your slaughter. Now rejoice at this. The Grand Marshals remain in camp at Woodford, afraid to come farther, and he'll soon turn tail and march home to Edgefield. The invasion is over, and you have won the day for us all." End of chapter 25. And we go again in a brief pause, but we start off with the last chapter of today. Good. Let us end today reading with another brief chapter. Only 3 today. They are 35 at all, so we remain to read 9 chapters, I think. 27, 28, 29, 30, and the last 5. I think we can make it. Okay. Let's read. Our last chapter of today, chapter 26. Patchwall, the month called Brightleaf by Elfenkind, was half gone. The first faint pigments of autumn were beginning to paint the green of Idris forest giants in gold, scarlet, and russet. It was time to go. And Gord felt a poignancy he had never experienced in similar situations. Before now, departure had simply meant he would be placing his boots beneath a new pallet. Gord tried to identify the reason for his feelings. Did he feel that moving away from this place near the Blimo Hills will finally separate him from Eva League? No, that thought was foolish, he decided, for by now she was surely wedded and dwelling far to the north, in her new archbaronial estate. Then was it because he had grown unusually fond of the woods folk? This was quite possible. Gord admired their friendliness, their comradeship, and their fighting skill, and he was still flushed with pride for the small part he had played in the victory at Woodford. One hates to leave the scene of a success, he reasoned, and this last adventure had certainly been a success for him. Shart felt no such pangs, even though he was leaving the area he knew as home. The big man was whistling merrily as he readied his gear for the journey. But after all, this was special for him. The giant had never ventured more than a league or two beyond the timberland, and the prospect of a journey into the outside world excited him. Besides, he and Gord were going with Gellor and Curly Greenleaf, bound for the royal court at Realmord. Great doings indeed! As Gellor had confidently predicted, the survivors of the battle at Woodford did indeed hear news that the Grand Marshal of Aerdy had turned his army back toward its starting point, Edgefield. Even though the invaders technically had been victorious in the battle, the retreat was an understandable decision. Not only was the Wolver King's host no longer fit to conduct a long campaign, but the Nyrondale force in and around Nurl will most certainly be alerted and on guard against an attempt to advance farther. With two such marks against him, Grand Marshal Drake had little choice other than to turn back and face the wrath of Ivid. In a way, Gord felt sorry for the soldiers of the retreating army. Many of the woods folk immediately opted to follow the enemy on its long trek eastward, to harass its columns and exact further vengeance for the invasion of their forest. With them went the Elves, for they too sought to deliver a lesson to the trespassers that would be long remembered. Those who remained searched for wounded, cared for their dead, and gathered the spoils of what was a true victory from the field abandoned by the Aerdians. A few prisoners were rounded up from their hiding place in the nearby woods. Renegade woodsmen were given swift justice. Mercenaries were warned and set free, warned to get far away as quickly as they could. A handful of guardsmen, most of whom were knights of the Malachite throne, were taken prisoner, and a great debate as to their fate eventually ended in a decision to ransom them, with the money gained thus to be divided among the families of those woods folk killed in the fighting. A week after the great combat, Gord found it difficult to believe such a battle had been fought at the ford. Only the marks of the spell's destructive forces could be seen, and even these were already being covered by the rampant verdure. The contingent from Stalker's warband was burdened with its share of spoils when it began its march onward, and it took several days longer to return than the march to the battlefield had required. Even with clerical and druidical healing, wounds were evident and painful. Stalker himself had been so badly hurt that Gord marveled he was able to be up and around in only a few days, let alone able to lead the return of his warband. But lead he did, and eventually the survivors were safely within the precincts of their community, and life returned to their routine. Save for the trophies displayed on log walls and fireplace stones, and the recounting of deeds told at gatherings, Woodford was again nothing more than a convenient place to cross the Harp River, and the hunting, foresting, and mundane concerns of life within the Aedry forest were again paramount. After making his address to the veterans of the battle, Gellor went on some sort of mission, as was his wont. Gord had now grown used to his sudden leave-taking and equally abrupt reappearance. Knowing that he would return in good time, Gord took the opportunity to stay with the woodsmen for a while and learn more of the ways of these people and their environment. He occasionally enjoyed the company of his great barbarian friend, but Shart was not around too much, since he and Ran were keeping company. Curly Greenleaf soon returned to the place, however, and he often had time to spend with the young thief. Good. Gord found this a most acceptable substitute, for the druid informed him not only of the forest but of his persuasion as well. The idea that all things were a necessary part of life troubled Gord, but he found that he had to agree with many of the plump fellow's arguments. Without light, we could understand darkness, and vice versa. This badness enabled the concept of good to be understood, and the cycle of birth and death, growth and decay, and each other pair of opposites were all part of a wheel that must forever turn if living things were to exist. On matters affecting the Woodslands, however, the druid was not so neutral. Gord looked at this, for the young adventurer had an idea that despite everyone's protest, each had some particular point of view that was held above all others as the ultimate value or truth. Some sought order, others exposed total freedom for the individual. There were groups proclaiming that will must be brought to all, while their opposites said the strongest must always prevail. Greenleaf's moral and ethical views had their strengths, but Gord also noted weaknesses. He was wise enough not to point them out again after doing so once, for the heated debate that followed was quite enough for a lifetime as far as Gord was concerned. Thereafter he kept such thoughts and opinions to himself. All said and done, the world seemed the place where man and deity put forth laws and ideas, dogma and lore to explain that which simply was. The whys and wherefores of it all were inexplicable to Gord, and as long as he managed to feel good and prosper, he was satisfied enough. If one day he was enlightened as to the mysteries of the multiverse, so much the better, but meanwhile there was life to live. Information from Curly regarding the arcane business of invocation of unknown forces and energies interested Gord far more than talk of worldviews and philosophies. His days as a student had gained him much knowledge in many fields, but he knew very little of spellcasting and associated arts. While Curly Greenleaf did not actually instruct him in the secrets of druidical dwemer crafting, he did explain much of the theory and practice of the arts and disciplines involved not only with his, but also clerical and magical spells as well. Gord thought that such lore would be most useful in understanding the workings of magical protections and devices, as well as to measure the potential of an adversary. He candidly told Curly this, and the druid looked and accepted this observation, for his own philosophy and theology demanded such. Knowledge was part of the necessary wall, after all. So the days rolled into weeks, and then Gallor returned again. He came to see his friends, and for no other purpose, he said. After the battle he had gone to the Blimo Hills, where King Archibald held court in Dustan Castle. Afterward, with all necessary business there accomplished, he had paid his respects to the young king in the Flinty Hills once again, and then come back to this place in the Aedry. Gallor asked if Gord still cared to accompany him to Royal Mord, as the two had once planned. Gord eagerly accepted the invitation, although he subsequently had made reservations about leaving. Shert, by now, also was desirous of broadening his horizons, for he and the Amazonian Wren had come to a parting of the ways, mainly due to the mighty Tued barbarian's lack of interest in family life. The situation was uncomfortable, and the trip to a distant place was indeed a bright prospect under such circumstances. Gord took the idea of a group journey to Royal Mord grand, as did Curly Greenleaf, who planned on traveling in that direction anyway, having druidical business of some sort in the distant Celadon forest, west and south of Nairon's capital city. So, after the raw farewells and rude adieux customary to a leave-taking between forest folk, the four adventurers rode out of Stalker's Thorpe. Gord and Gallor still had the horses they had received from Dustan. Greenleaf and the big barbarian were mounted on steeds of questionable worth, but ones that could be traded for more suitable animals and inspa. Gord wore a shirt of mail of such fine workmanship and lightness that it was undetectable beneath his outer garments. Greenleaf said it was chainmail of heavy make, and Gord was fortunate that he was of a size to be able to don it. The armor had come to him as his part of the spoils of war, just as had Shert's broadsword, shield, helmet, and mount. The four stayed only briefly within the town of Inspa, and with new horses under their companions, Gord and Gallor rode slightly ahead of the barbarians and the druid on the long highway running westward to Realmord. As the flinty hills slowly became a dim line on the horizon to his rear, Gord spoke to his companion. "If you should ever see Valig again in your travels, Gallor, will you tell her that I helped to assure the safety of her father's fiefdom? And that of her husband's Palpatine barony as well?" The one-eyed man looked at his young friend for a long moment, weighing the statement. "Yes, Gord, I will assuredly tell your Eva League that, should the private moment to do so ever present itself." Satisfied, Gord nodded and rode on, whistling a little tune. The journey to Realmore took just a little over a fortnight to accomplish, for they did not ride hard. During the course of the trip, Gord inquired of Curly Greenleaf as to his mode of transportation. After all, as Curly himself had said on more than one occasion, druids had means of moving about that took only minutes and covered hundreds of leagues. "There is more to life than hair, tree, and sun, if you will pardon that near blasphemy," exclaimed the druid. "We do have such ways and means, but druids are human, or partially so, in cases such as myself, and we enjoy good company too." Both of the younger adventurers had to agree to that, as they found the journey most enjoyable, traveling as they were in company. Eventually the four came to the great capital of Nyron, and outside its wall Curly Greenleaf parted from his friends. He had little love for, and no interest in, the doings of such places of buildings and folk not attuned to nature. He said he would visit a few small places nearby where the druidical beliefs were still honored, and thereafter use his powers to go swiftly on to the Celadon. He said he would leave word at Woodwitch as to his whereabouts, just in case anyone wanted to look him up later, and with that he left. Gallor brought Gord and Shard to the Nyrondel royal court, where they had an audience with King Archibald. While Gallor was for some reason not mentioned, Gord and Shard were fitted properly. Although Gallor never volunteered the information and Gord never asked, the young thief presumed that Gallor's value to the king as a diplomat and intermediary would have been seriously compromised if Gallor had been included in the group of celebrities. Anonymity was an ally of one such as Gallor, but Gord and Shard did not need to wear the same cloak. The celebrated and handsome pair of heroes from the great battle in the Aedri became desirable guests for the season, and they found themselves responding to a round of invitations to villas and nearby castles that didn't play itself out until Sunseb was past and the last chill of fire-sick month was giving way to the sun's growing warmth. When eventually, there were no longer novelties for festive display, and the ladies of the court had begun to seek elsewhere for swains. The two were actually glad. It was an exhausting business, the sophisticated routine of banquets, parties, love-making, and intrigue. The barbarian was particularly disgusted with what he referred to as foppery and frippery, stating flatly that this was the reason that his swords were destined to inherit the world. The decadence and soft living of city and town, he proclaimed, would eventually cause the downfall of what these people call civilization. And then true folk would rule a cleaner and more simple hearth, in which real virtues would be recognized. While Gord wasn't ready to agree with his friend as to the merits of what the barbarian held as virtues, Gord wasn't so certain that the fellow's predictions about the downfall of the society of kingdom and state would not eventuate. Despite all of his predictions and the remonstrances against the lifestyles of Realmord, Shard, and Gord too for that matter, did enjoy the time, attention, and ministration of the lovely but fickle ladies of the city. When in due course they were ready to leave, Shard was indifferent as to where they would travel, but Gord decided that he had seen enough of the East to last him for at least some time. The two agreed to head westward toward Woodwitch and see if they could pick up some news of Curly Greenleaf. They had known for some time that when they wanted to embark they would do so without Gallor, for he was involved in more of his own mysterious dealings, and his responsibilities would take him elsewhere. Gallor gave them his wishes for safe and profitable wayfaring, as well as a map of the territory in which they planned to adventure. Thus equipped, Gord and his great-sized friends set forth again as the month of cold even ended and Growfest was being celebrated. Both young men marveled greatly over the high bridge which spanned the Untitled River just below Realmord. The way to Woodwich was rather uneventful after that. Both had travelled much in recent months, and familiarity with such a process made the simple matter of going from one place to another less than thrilling. Going as they were through the central portions of the kingdom, there wasn't even the excitement of an encounter with marauder or monster to enliven things. They did run across some highwaymen, and that brief action broke the monotony, but the brigands soon fled, feeling that the loss of a half-score of their number was sufficient justification for the decision not to press the pair further. Soon Gord and Shard came to Woodwich, and there they sought out the chapel of Farlangd. There, Gallor had told them, was the place in that town where their friend Curly Greenleaf would leave word as to his whereabouts, whether near or far. Later, both Gord and Shard would look back upon their arrival at the chapel as the beginning of their next great adventure together. And with this, we end our chapter 26 and our reading for today. So, after all, a mass combat battle of Woodford, and then two new friends, Curly, Greenleaf and Shard. Let's see how things proceed next time, Wednesday evening. And for this time, it's all. So I make you a good evening, good dinner, good night, good everything, and we are gonna see ourselves Wednesday evening. Bye!